Okay.
Okay, Professor, why don't we get started?
All right. Let's get started with week 3, session 1. I'll remind you that last time we went over Adorno, Bourdieu, Hollywoodization, and the general theme challenged by Laurent Fleury at the end was top down. What drives culture? The simple answer, drawing largely on Marx in the case of Adorno, was capitalism, the owners of Hollywood, the investors drive the content because they have access to, they own, or they're the managers and owners of the means of production, which are the cameramen, the cinemas, the big studios, etc. And that this then diffuses out. And in those days, all the local cinemas in small towns or medium-sized cities were owned by Warner Brothers, MGM, and so forth in the US. And internationally, often things were more hierarchical as a state could control film, movie houses, television, etc. So that's the strong top-down model, which we have in most of the readings last week. Adorno, Bourdieu simile, the high and the low status. And Fleury then challenged this with the example of Beaubourg in Paris. And he showed that with the right institutional arrangements, with having monitors and mentors and Communist Party cell members and friends, or the version that Lazarsfeld and company elaborated in the US, was that women shopping together on a Saturday afternoon could even talk about politics and who you vote for while they were choosing red shoes. Okay, so we have the top-down model being potentially challenged, but today we're going to go back and forth. We're going to look at some things that are more top-down and others that are not. And we're looking then at the role of the arts related to social background, such as status, access to the means of production in the general, loosely, broadly Marxian framework, and then bottom up in various ways. And where and how can we get bottom up rather than top down? We're going to look at some examples and then generalize a little bit, and begin with these are items on the reading list, but I'm going to talk first about Habermas and the background of Habermas, which contrasts, a simple main contrast is between the European continent, with France as a leading example, and Versailles, as we saw earlier on a few sessions back. The starchitecture of Versailles is leading to this cultural domination of the civilized world as it was then seen by the French, by the Russians, by the Italians, the Spanish would all come to Versailles. They would take these models of culture back, and the French were seen with both the traditional Ancien Regime of the Versailles past, plus the guillotine, the revolution, 1789, equality, fraternity, etc., led by Napoleon, with the rationality, the metric system spread across through Eastern Europe, Russia, and so forth. Okay, if this is the background with Habermas, let's elaborate a little bit more of what Habermas specifically added. As Habermas was a student of Adorno and Horkheimer in Frankfurt. He was one of the most brilliant students who carried on, but then after 1968, Adorno basically Adorno died just before 68. With around 1968, we had a major cultural change, and I would say a challenge and transformation of many of the rules of the game involving culture. And the simple word is egalitarianism. Instead of top-down, bottom-up, or let's say more equality, more self-management in workers' enterprises, students serving on committees, a bottom-up style became more successful, more visible, more legitimate. It was a basis of legitimacy. So in terms of our scenes dimensions, the egalitarianism dimension was far more stressed than simply a year before and after 68. I'm suggesting a serious historical change, although mainly it's over the centuries that these things. But If you take Mao before and after Mao in the 40s, or take Mao again with the Cultural Revolution, we have had several Chinese who maintained that Chinese traditional culture was destroyed by the Cultural Revolution of Mao. Others still see elements of the past in China and in Europe, that is, including the pre-1789 Europe. And where and how can we capture these elements and where they fit together? The subtlety of doing that is generally better in novelists, poets, and filmmakers than it is in the simple demographic and census type data, which some historians and some social scientists have used. But social scientists are not prohibited, as I pointed out, from using subtle cultural sources, whether they're like a novel and so Max Weber wrote about Tolstoy in War and Peace when he talked about the more subtle relations between eros and the background of religious traditions, and how they transformed people's conceptions of what they were doing and why they were doing them, and how they felt in their hearts. Okay. What's the main big characterization that we should start with as a foundation for Habermas? The simple answer is to contrast England with the continent. That England, again, in conjunction with Marx and with Max Weber, England is where the Industrial Revolution began. They had the factories, they had capitalism developed with the London stock market, they had trade with India in conjunction with the colonial expansion, they traded with China. And then, as Habermas puts it, the coffee house as a cultural center was something which illustrates this. And the coffee house is a critical example here, which Habermas only began using, or he really elaborated. I shouldn't say that. Let me get the dates right. Habermas said this before 1968. He saw this from seeing the historical evolution and by contrasting the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. So he portrayed, of course, the European continental style, and the critical driver, that is, why was England different for Habermas? The big simple answer was, again, political authoritarianism. That most of the continental countries had politically dominating, controlling leaders, so much that within their immediate surroundings, the court of the king, the court of a duke or a prince in a smaller German principality, as well as later on in Berlin, these were controlled politically to a degree that you did not have the open citizen bottom-up kind of political exchanges which you had in the English coffee houses. And there were hundreds of these in London. Soon after coffee was brought into Europe, it made a revolution. There were maybe something like 600 coffee houses in London in a couple of years, and there were the beginnings of coffee in different European continental contexts as well. The style around the court and the king of hierarchy was continued in some smaller social contexts, which did not challenge the king, but sought to reproduce elements of the hierarchical court system. These existed before the French Revolution as well, led often by nobles, not necessarily, but the most famous ones initially in the 18th century were noble-led. These could be in a private home, they could be in a small castle in a smaller town. It might be linked with the court, but But these were also, as I've said, following Habermas here, non-politically driven. That is, what people talked about was not politics or economics. Instead, they talked much more about culture, the arts, aesthetics, style, food, dresses, perfume, wine, who was having an affair with whom and why, and what that might lead to in terms of political, or I shouldn't say political here, but how these various social relations were important in transforming some of who, well, first of all, who was invited to the salon, who was not invited, and might someone show up, and if she showed up and shocked the people who were already there, this would in turn transform some of the discussions, the gossip and the like, which was mixed with the culture in many of the salons. Okay, the next link which Habermas is building toward is the idea of the public. The public was not just isolated atomistic citizens, it was most specifically manifested in the example of culture such as newsletters, newspapers, which took off with the printing press. As the printing press was invented and began to be more used on a large scale basis, late 18th, 19th, and then rising in the 19th century, printing presses get larger, more efficient, and became more mass, part of the beginnings of the mass media. And Habermas really focused on how these emerged and how they changed. And the general story was in Germany and France, these were largely little magazines, reviews. They were started mostly by men of letters, writers, poets, novelists. And the technology and making money was not big because they were writing for a small crowd, often their friends, more like a blog at the beginning today. Over the 19th century, as newspapers and the investment, the technology became more expensive, more elaborate, and they reached hundreds of thousands of people, then the initial men of letters tended to be superseded, and this is the quasi-Marxian analysis, superseded by managers, by bigger industrialists and more capital. And capitalism in that sense was part of the story by Habermas. His Marxist background showed in that respect. However, the content of the culture began to change, and this is what he interestingly features, in how it differed in England and so he uses the cross-national comparison at the beginning to inform the bigger historical developments because they simply happened first in England, and this happened again later in Germany and France. So 1789 in France. Nevertheless, through the 19th century, there was enough revolution, counter-revolution, restoration with Napoleon, with Louis Napoleon. Through most of the 19th century, democracy was a pretty limited, specific label for the degree of censorship. So people talk about censorship in China. Censorship is an old European tradition and all around the world. And so the printing presses would be owned, watched, related. Public meetings were illegal. Political discussions were censored or illegal or closed down, or people were arrested in France, in parts of Germany, and so forth. However, people could and did meet in these salons, in these coffee houses, and talk to one another in ways that had a more, as I'm suggesting, an artistically, an aesthetic focus, but in a sense, it was largely considered illegitimate or wrong to talk about money, the economy, investment. Who are you supporting politically and why? Those were not legitimate topics in general on the continent, although people could rumor about them. By contrast, in England, these were central themes. People talked about making money. They talked about trading. They built wagering into what people did in coffee shops, and not just wagering on trying to throw darts onto a wall, but will the next ship come in? Will that factory that John Smith is building in Birmingham become successful? And how much would you bet, or might you invest? How much would you pay if you wanted to buy some shares in that factory? These were the origins of the big London stock market and the insurance companies like Lloyd's of London, which would insure ships for each voyage to India, as these were dangerous. Lots of ships did not come back. And so the idea of wagering and having insurance behind you if you were a ship owner or you wanted to participate in the investment about one voyage, these were continually negotiated by sea captains, by others in the London coffee houses. So if we could begin, I think could we have a video maybe first just on the London coffee house, Alan? Would that work for you? That's second. First of all, do we have the London coffee house easily? There we go. Great. Just about 1 minute or so of this. That's the current London situation.
Glass structures, although attractive, tend to be somewhat characterless. And in the city, for example, centuries of tradition cannot be overlooked by the architect. This place, abounding in tradition, is the home today of the world's center of shipping information and the great insurance market. And this is what Lloyd's of London looked like when it opened in 1688 as a coffee house. Coffee in those days had only been drunk for 20 years or so, and fashionable coffee houses were enjoying the boom that espresso bars are today, on a much smaller scale, of course. Each one attracted different sections of the community, and Edward Lloyd, situated near the river, catered for ships' captains and merchants. To encourage this custom, he even started an intelligence-cum-news service, dispatching runners to the docks to fetch the latest shipping news, which was read from a pulpit. As an additional service, he also held auctions. Let's listen.
Merchants or sea captains. They may have a sale by candle later on this morning. Ah, the coffee. Thank you, lad. Ah, the candle. As the flame is extinguished, the last bidder is the person who gets the vessel. Now then, see what you think of this coffee.
As you heard, the property being auctioned goes to the man who bids last before the candle goes out.
And 25. And 25. And 25. 1,200 guineas.
Sold to Mr. Durant for 1,200 guineas.
You're too late, gentlemen.
Because of this concentration of captains and merchants, the insurance brokers of the time began going here instead of from office to office. Needless to say, the business conversations were somewhat more protracted than in our reconstruction.
Write a line on the Worcester, going from London to China.
What's the rate, sir?
18 guineas per cent. First class risk.
Yes, all right then.
Thank you very much.
Good morning,
Captain Lyons, very nice seeing you.
How's business?
Very well, thank you.
Hello, today?
Morning.
Good morning to you.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Okay, so this is the archetypical London coffee house, of which there were hundreds. The contrast was most dramatic, as I've said, with the French and the films. I mean, to try to capture a film, we can't get from the original stuff, but we can get films that recreate some of these scenes. And if we look for the best known, the most detailed literary film aesthetic discussion of how did these discussions work on the continent and especially in Paris, it is the 5-volume novel of Marcel Proust, which I think most people would immediately mention as the most discussed, the most detailed, and why, even though it was when it was written and the actions with it were anachronistic. That is, Proust saw that the court, the aristocracy, as it had existed before 1789, was not totally dead, but it was dying, and it was completely out of step with the present society he lived in and with the future. And so part of the attraction for Proust and for the reader was to say, what was life like in France under Louis XIV, in Versailles, in this elegant past, which is no longer here. We become democratized. Egalitarianism is spreading. The French Republic from 1870 onward with Durkheim is transforming education. We had the beginnings of democracy and egalitarian mass institutions. And so to counter that, Proust wrote these 5 volumes about memory, and one of the most central elements surrounding the memory was conversation. Gabriel Tarde wrote as well about the ideals of conversation. And you have this too in William Faulkner in the US, in the American South, that Faulkner wrote in the 1930s, essentially, about the death of the Old South, but how the old elements of the Old South persisted within the newer South in relations among family members who were intermarried in different ways and who had not just relations within their family, but they had relations with Black and white, former slaves and former masters, people who were Highlanders in the mountains and that were more egalitarian. So these 3 castes, if you will, or strong class kinds of backgrounds, were variously mixed within exchanges, arguments, disagreements in the major novel Faulkner. But I'm stressing the subtlety of the novelist, because these things were not simply happening the way they did a couple of hundred years before. Art played a key role in transforming, articulating, and adding meaning and emotional attachment to these different activities in different ways. Similarly, one of the, if not the most popular film ever made is called Gone with the Wind, where Scarlett O'Hara, the daughter of a traditional manor house, an American Southern plantation, loses her family home in the Civil War as the South loses, the Old South loses its legacy. She goes to Atlanta, she marries, she's working with her husband to try to make money, and she rises, but she loses her roots. She gives up her aesthetic, traditional Southern background so much that she's adopted many of the values of the new urban, that she becomes sort of Northern to the degree that she alienates her own daughter, for whom she's trying to build up a financial and nest egg and whatever, and connections and more. Her own daughter leaves her, so it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy because she has abandoned her background. She loses her daughter, she loses everything. But at the same time, it has elements of rural China, of rural Italy, of rural Sweden, that people see in themselves, and it is more watched, it has been watched by more people in Sweden than all of the films of the great Swedish film director Bergman combined. So in that sense, Gone with the Wind captures these elements which people are talking about in rural India, in rural China today, and they are with us. Okay, if that's an American Hollywood version, let's go back to a French film version, which has been adapted in quite recent years, not even by a Frenchman, he's by an Argentine film director, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z. The film won many prizes and discussions at Cannes and in the New York Film Festival, and it gives you a sense of the Parisian salon when it was already anachronistic, but at least it's here. So let's look at just a few minutes of this to give you a flavor of the traditional elite.
Ah, cher ami, quel plaisir de vous voir ici. Je n'y croyais plus. Ma chère amie. Mais quel plaisir de vous voir ici. Je n'y croyais plus. Et comment va monsieur le Fourcheville? Les patatis, et patata. Oh, j'aime pas abuser du champagne. Mais c'est tellement beau. Vous savez que je reviens de Tansonville. Ah, j'ai une lettre pour vous. Je crois qu'elle a vécu l'enfer. Elle a du cran, ma Gilberte. C'est bien ce qui manque aux Allemands. Enfin, je ne dis pas qu'ils ne savent pas se battre. Mais il leur manque justement ce qu'on appelle le cran.
Et Robert, vous avez des nouvelles?
At the beginning, so if I didn't have enough there, just slide forward or back, and most it's of this crowd.
So in a saloon?
Yes, we want the bigger salon, not just people talking individually. Yeah, okay, this is good, I think. Yeah, just back
Ce qui m'a guidé dans ma réflexion, c'est le respect pour nos chers combattants. Je me suis demandé à quoi ils pouvaient bien rêver au fond de leurs tranchées. Et je me suis dit, à plus de coquetterie. Pour la chère absente laissée seule au foyer, mais sans excès, sans luxe de mauvais aloi, non. Des petits riens, qui effacent par une note lumineuse les tristes heures que nous vivons. Pour un grand couturier, c'est la seule manière de contribuer à l'effort national.
C'est un devoir qui nous oblige tous. Je vous fais servir du thé, des petits gâteaux, non? Il va donc falloir nous restreindre sur tout. La nourriture, le gaz, l'électricité.
Le Sénat vient de ratifier la loi.
Il paraît même que l'adultère va devenir plus cher.
L'adultère.
Ouais. Oui, ça aussi, nous l'avons fait voter. L'adultère passe de 25 à 100 francs d'amende, avec en prime quelques jours de prison.
Franchement, je ne vois pas qui peut souffrir ici de cette nouvelle taxe.
Vous l'avez reconnu finalement?
C'est stupide, j'ai son nom sur les lèvres. Aidez-moi.
Non. Charlie, vous allez nous jouer quelque chose qui s'accorde avec le crépuscule.
Soit. Toujours aucune nouvelle d'Odette?
Non. Je ne sais pas pourquoi on ne la voit plus ici. Elle est peut-être froissée. Moi, pas. Somme toute, qu'est-ce que je lui ai fait? C'est chez moi qu'elle a connu ses deux maris. Si elle veut revenir, qu'elle sache que les portes de mon salon lui sont grandes ouvertes.
Yeah, I think this is where the saloon.
Yeah, this is during World War I. So just as the Gone with the Wind, the contrast is so dramatic that they continue during the Civil War with the Sherman invasion of Atlanta. Here in World War I, this elite crowd is having a designer showing he can make dresses that are including bits of shrapnel to show solidarity with the soldiers, etc. Okay, so here's his sketch made from shrapnel. Okay, those are the times that I gave you. Was there anything else, or that's basically it? Alan?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's go from yeah, that's fine. That's all I have there. Okay. I mean, I can elaborate, but what if we stop there a little bit for comment on just these beginnings with this quick overview of Habermas, the elite, the top-down model, and the Proustian salon, and I will even add that Qi Ji is Qi Ji here today? Maybe not, but basically she started in China a year or so ago, a salon of scenes work. And she used the old French term, and some of the other people have not used that term. They've talked about research meeting and other things, but I was going to ask her if she wanted to comment on that. But the themes are briefly there. Anyone want to comment on the even say, especially if there are things which you have in the reading you want to bring in that I didn't touch on, but which are important in context among these readings from last week and which we're now getting into this week? Including any of our 3 teaching assistants, if you want to comment, raise questions. I have the questions which I'm holding for a little later from you, Brandon, that you got from the discussion board. That is, there were three student questions, but I'm waiting on those for a little bit. I'm looking here as well at the other issues. Think as well of even the fundamental sense of taste. Remember the China potatoes, potato, the song of Sister Potato, and how this is now driven by her. I mean, what are the drivers? There are 3 different drivers which are featured in that video, and these are playing off in the discussions. These are the bigger themes behind some of what we're reading, but let's explicitly contrast some of the videos with the bigger theories. One is just with the potato example. One is the Chinese government. It starts with the idea that the Chinese landmass is so huge. There's so many people, but that there's not enough land to continue feeding people rice in the future. So the Chinese are importing food from the United States today to feed the Chinese. This is a problem which the Chinese are looking for more independence. So one answer is the potato. And so the national government has had certain incentives, some subsidies to get people to grow potatoes in desert areas where irrigation is making potato farming successful in ways that make it more effective. Okay, so model 1 is the background of economic demand. The key actor is the national government, but then you have subsidies so that the woman, Sister Potato, had no background in agriculture. She had no background in that region. She moved there because of the government subsidy, and so she started doing this. Okay, so the second incentives, which they featured in the video, is that she wanted to make money. And so someone said, will you give me a sample? And she said, only if you buy it. So she laughed and said, you know, I want to make some money. So in a sense, that's the second incentive, the entrepreneurial individual, capitalist or non-capitalist, small or big, whatever, could be seen as a driver. The third major actor in this process in the video is the Chinese consumer and eater. So the Chinese consumer and eater wants to have rice. Can the Chinese consumer be persuaded to stop eating rice and start eating potatoes? That's the $64 question. So all three of these are going on simultaneously. The news then is, and we're adding then another critical factor which links with Paris, is the song and the teasing and the sort of campy, amusing, ironic style in her own way of Sister Potato, that she can laugh at herself and laugh at her song, but she sings the song about it will prevent cancer, it will help you reduce it, you get it helps everything which with your health and so forth. A simple quantitative measure is that the price of the potatoes in the region where she specifically lives and where she sells her potatoes with her neighbors from that region, the price of their potatoes, like a fine Chinese wine or a French wine, are much higher than the surrounding potato growing areas. So the market price of the potato inside China is an index that the song, some people are suggesting, the song is, and the style of Sister Potato as an artist. She's not just an artist, she's also a capitalist, she's also an entrepreneur, she's also a Communist Party member. But the artistic style may be having an impact on the price, so she's making more money because of the song. Okay, those are the different distinct elements, and I'm asking you to look for these kinds of multiple drivers in the same person, even in the same video, in the ways that they may be operating, because today we have mixed dynamics, mixed economies, mixed political systems within China, within traditional France, within the US, including things like debates over the the coronavirus and how to respond it between the governor of Illinois and the President Trump, etc. These kinds of debates are going on in the middle of a political campaign where Trump wants the economy to be featured. That's the main thing he wants to say he's succeeded at doing. And if it's in disaster, he may be in disaster as well. So the stakes are very, very high, as they've been over years in the past. Okay, so Habermas gives us this contrast. And one kind of perspective, but what I'm adding more explicitly is the context, and this is what we also saw added with the example of Beaubourg and the book of Laurent Fleury, that you can have something that looks like a museum, it looks like high art, which should belong to an elite, but the dramatic finding of Fleury was average and poor working class blue collar workers could come to the Beaubourg Museum at a rate which was very similar to that of high status, high educated, high income, high occupation persons. In that sense, the Ministry of Culture in France was not a failure, as Bourdieu said again and again and again in almost all of his work. So The second one, which it built on, was the TNP, the most important theater, and they both had a combination of these specific elements. Monitors, people, personal relationships, joined with the ironic or ambiguous or humorous, sometimes challenging, sometimes anti-capitalist or anti-establishment. These different elements with subtlety can have been and can be analyzed more closely. And so I'm bringing some of those in to show that we can use different styles of social science research to capture these, and we don't need to use just census data or just crude financial data which currently exists. One can understand the future of the economy as well as the political system, as well as social arrangements, by looking at both salons and Sister Potato and other people of high and low social backgrounds, to use those in the Habermasian, or let's say even more, the Adorno-Horkheimer kind of way. Let's push on then with okay, have I? Yeah, I think I just sent you. I sent you about a half an hour ago the address links for Forrest Stewart. I think that was the subject in the email. If you can look at that and put those on, I'll introduce that. And it even suggests taking a look. Yeah, if this. Yeah, okay, here we go. Yeah, let's start right at the top of this. Okay, this is a story from this year in the Vancouver, Canada newspaper. Okay, but get simply first the heading, the newspaper heading. Real scoop, violent rap lyrics escalate gang tensions. Then let's let you read a little bit in the background of the key stuff at the beginning of this story. This guy has pleaded guilty. He's murdered. He's charged with murdering a couple of people starting a year ago, and but then the highlighted is the local rappers are mimicking Chicago gang drill music. Experts say the trend of gangsters using rap lyrics to condemn and threaten rivals started with Chicago drill music and has spread New York, Paris, Brixton, Ireland, and even Toronto. Okay, Forrest Stewart right now he's in Stanford, spent 2 years studying the gangs, and his book will be out in a few more months. It should be next month if it's on time. Ballad of the Bullet, Gangs, Drill Music, and the Power of Online Infamy. Stewart said the new okay, so you're seeing this there, but he uses the example that were used in Chicago of Dis and ops for opposition, pole or pipe for gun are being adopted in rap lyrics by gangs, even here in British Columbia, even though, as Stewart points out, the kids didn't use guns. There were more, they stabbed their victims more often. Okay, so okay, so how much of, where is there causality? Obviously, that's highly sensitive and very difficult to say. Is the art causing the violence? Is the violence causing the rap? Where are these, and should we talk about causality at all? So Forrest and I would bicycle around Chicago. We'd bike into different neighborhoods, talk about this stuff, and we've had students working with us on these themes for a number of years. So what I'm featuring here is how these big theoretical questions can be explored in Chicago neighborhoods by looking closely at what's going on. Can we play then now this little interview with Forrest?
Okay. All right. sure it's.
He was here for 6 or 7 years.
The fundamental change that we've seen in terms of putting policing on the national radar has to be digital social media. We've seen this massive democratization in terms of communication technology. Some recent statistics have actually come out from here, from the University of Chicago, that actually shows that Black youth are some of the most prolific users of social media, and they're also the social group, racial group that is uploading original content and modifying content online at the highest rate, sometimes two times the rate that white kids are. And so I think that when you combine that with the fact that there are certain issues that are affecting the Black community in America, when you combine those two, then I think it's kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of natural that we're going to see a kind of explosion of lived reality. While I was doing my work on Skid Row, I think one of the major things that I realized was that poor urban residents and the police essentially were suffering to a certain extent from the same exact policies that have been handed down, over the last few decades, right? So we've seen a real hollowing out of the welfare state. We've seen this amplification of policing and this call by cities to use police to solve a whole host of problems that we never used to necessarily see as policing issues. Things like mental illness, things like addiction, things like homelessness, things like general disorder, poverty in general. I think that one of the things that my research...
Let me stop there as he goes on. But I mean, the ethnographic point is powerful and clear. We have a second, I think there's a second link that I had there in the email. Yeah, here we go. So what is, let's see one drill rep. And I suggested look at the time, just get one.
Free bands, got my pockets racked up. Saying fuck the bees that get you whacked up. All these new niggas taking back up.
If a nigga ain't with me, they can get bang. All my niggas crazy, yeah, we is insane. If you with the ops, you can get bang. A new 40 with a 30, you can get bang. If a nigga ain't with me, they can get bang. All my niggas crazy, yeah, we is insane. If you with the ops, you can get bang. A new 40 with a 30, you can get bang. If a nigga ain't with me, they can get bang. All my niggas crazy, yeah, we insane. V12 money, you know we spending things. I got a red bone bitch, but she ain't my man. I'm spending money, yeah, I'm stacking chips.
Okay, that's there's lots on here. That this was from 15 top drill rappers. Here we go. If you want more, it's all on the web. The simple point is, this is not just people in a Parisian salon who are using the art. This is not just shippers and captains and ship owners in London. This is poor, young African-American, unemployed or underemployed men who are using the art. The big point in the book, which is coming out, which he didn't talk about per se, is that in the past, there was a sense of macho struggle between individuals, maybe on a street corner in front of a liquor store or in a place where they might be selling drugs, where two gangs could conflict, fight, kill, scare, but try to move people off their turf or expand their turf. And this is a continual, this sort of turf battling and the battling among the individuals was classic when I taught at UCLA. The LA Times every few weeks when I was there was featuring how the Mexican gangs were moving north, and they were killing off the African Americans who were less numerous as they moved north, and where and how this was then, might this be in some way pacified if one could get together people and you could have a rap contest where African-American gangs and the Mexican gangs could even talk to each other. So that was attempted in LA, but this is taken further in what's going on now, as is featured in Forrest Stewart's book. Namely, his main simple point is that the bottom line is no longer just the turf physically, just shooting one person. So Forrest distinguishes between the drillers who make the music and the killers who actually kill. And one of his main findings, at least based on his admittedly limited sample, is about 90% of the young gang and related friends and activists, 90% are drillers. Only 10% are actual killers. So what they do then with their own selves and with their associates is to edit the media to make them look tougher, scary, but also how can they measure that this is successful or not? Guess what they use? YouTube ratings. The same as Hollywood, the same as the film stars. So the YouTube ratings of the individual videos produced in hundreds and hundreds by the young gang members or individuals who may not be in gangs, but the gangs are the most famous examples because they're showing that they're tough and they take credit for killing each other and so forth. And they insult each other in the videos as they were doing there. This was famously followed up about 5 years ago by a murder of another top gang member. And then a lot of the violence going on is between the gangs, as well as linked to what they portray of themselves and of their competitors in the videos. So there's lots of subtlety about how these are being portrayed. That is, their enemies have their hats worn in a different way, or they wear something on their shoulder, or they wear a different color. And if you wear the wrong clothes and you're a kid walking home from a high school, you can be killed. So the kids walking home from high schools are looking at these videos closely for clues as to what's safe and what's not safe as you're walking through the territory of more than one gang to get home. So these are serious issues today in different Chicago neighborhoods. Okay, let's push on for reasons of time to if we can get the Dan Silver presentation of the scenes chapter. Okay, here we go. Great, good job. Here's Dan Silver. Perfect.
Okay, check the next chapter that we have is on residence, and we call it home on the scene. And the way we sort of try to frame this and think about this is to start from a kind of much more, and the question is, how do scenes help us to think about the various kinds of glue that can hold the community together and shape how residential communities develop? One sort of simple classic way of thinking about that, and Terry mentioned this right at the outset, is that it's about production and jobs. People go to jobs and have their communities organized around where they work. And in the upper left, and this was mentioned earlier, there's Pullman, Illinois, and there we have the factory in the center, and it's laid out like that, and that is the classic case, right? People from all over the world, different nationalities and ethnicities, religions, thrown together based on their work role and their work relationship. Now, but Chicago, the rest of Chicago is one of the classic counterexamples to that kind of job-centric view. Because there you see in the upper right, we have church, and in the history of Chicago, many working class folks would work somewhere and then live in the neighborhood, organized around the church, ethnicity, festivals, parades, and so on. And so those are different ways that communities can be held together, and those forms of community belonging, persist in Chicago with newer immigrant groups as well. You can see the bottom, and they've expanded beyond ethnicity to other kinds of relations. And there's the Pride Parade. So that's one important thing that just the Chicago experience brings out, that there's these other ways. And it makes Chicagoans find it very natural to think in, like, say, in a pluralistic kind of way, to be sensitive to different habits, values, ways of life, and how those can hold communities together. To be struck by that possibility as a Chicagoan, you didn't have to travel on a boat around the world as an anthropologist to see that there's these other possibilities. You just walk across the park and there it is. And so that kind of spirit informs our thinking and our analysis in this chapter. And what we do is a very simple kind of thing, is to demonstrate that there are strong connections, controlling for many variables, between the character of the scene and the types of people who live there and the types of people who are moving there. We do that by age groups. We get into some interesting, again, interaction effects and spatial interactions, which I can elaborate, but I won't do so right now, by age group and by other demographic categories. The other part of this chapter is to think again about the question of community and community togetherness. One of the great themes we hear a lot about now in public commentary and more is the question, is America fragmenting? Is America dividing? Is there a real American community anymore? A single American community? You'll hear it across the political spectrum. From the right, you'll hear from people like Charles Murray that we're coming apart. You'll hear from the center, people like Bill Bishop, that there's a big sort going on where people with similar political sensibilities and cultural styles are living in worlds apart. And from the left, you'll hear the similar kinds of things from people like Richard Sennett. But when you think about it, and this is a quote from Hans Joas to sort of get us thinking about this, that kind of worry about, is America fragmenting, is as old as America itself. It's part of being an American to worry about the death of America and an American community, right? And that, if we take that seriously, I think that helps us to think about these questions in a different way. And we try to at least illustrate how to do that in the rest of this chapter in a more pluralistic and kind of cross-cutting way, where we're open to sources of division, separateness, and also practices that are simultaneously bridging and shared. So both division and sharedness simultaneously. We can think about what are sources of division, what are sources of sharedness, what contexts we find one or the other, and how do they shift over time and overlap in various ways. This section is building on work with Joseph Yee, who's been a great collaborator for much of this. In our paper that we wrote there is called God, Yoga, and Karate. And that illustrates we're thinking about here different kinds of sort of cultural practices. And what that means in this context is, by God, we're talking here about new conservative evangelical churches. Yoga we have various indicators of a kind of new age sensibility, and karate and other kinds of martial arts, as well as popular culture, are different kinds of cultural practices. And we're using those to get at this question of where do we find division, where do we find overlap. And the major thought here, and again we talk about why this would be the case in the finding, is that so all of these are kind of emergent practices. They've been growing. New conservative churches, new age practices have been growing, but they have universalistic ambitions, but they're mostly stuck in their milieu. They all want to break out and reach out to all people, but they're hitting against walls in general. The new conservative churches, there's a mega church, actually are home to quite a bit of racial diversity. They tend to be in neighborhoods that are relatively low educated, low income, but highly racially diverse. And there's other research that shows that inside the churches, they're quite racially diverse. But they don't reach out very far to the most educated Americans. So they hit a wall there. On the other side, when we think about the history of New Age movements, we find that, yoga as a practice entered the United States with the Cambridge Transcendentalists, and then it expanded in Esalen in Northern California, near where I grew up. And Berkeley, and yoga has expanded greatly, but in terms of its geographic locations and its social milieu, it stays primarily with highly educated people who are mostly white. So we find results showing that is the case, that these are the areas where these are located, and that's a source of division and difference, cultural division and difference, but there's also sources of bridging and overlap. On the left, we've got an example of popular culture. Popular culture is also part of American culture, even though some of us might not think so. It is, and it's an exemplification of the great openness to experimentation, pragmatism that one finds in American culture. And so you can walk into a Walmart and you will find Jesus candles and yoga mats on the same shelf, right? You can go to a McDonald's and you will find a big burger and you will find a smoothie and a Tuscan salad in the same place. So these are places that are, these are kinds of practices, and also when we look at our data, we find indicators of those kinds of popular culture practices across the board in all sorts of different kinds of neighborhoods that are very demographically different. Now, what about karate and the martial arts? This is again coming from collaboration with Joseph Yee, and his idea, which we've sort of carried forward, is that there's something very interesting about the martial arts, and it's worth talking about it a bit more, in that they sit at the intersection of many of the great American cultural divisions, and in a way that puts them orthogonal to them. They're not black, they're not white, they're not Christian, but they're not anti-Christian. Their entry path into American culture was not through the New Age hippies. It was through the military, which made them much more hospitable to and acceptable to all sorts of evangelical Christians. It helped to integrate them into to popular culture in various ways that something like yoga and New Age has never really been able to do. And the result is, is that secular, progressive, Birkenstock-wearing professors feel fine sending their kids to martial arts classes, as do evangelical Christians who love their guns. Both of those things happen frequently. And we find lots of evidence that is the case. Martial arts clubs are cut across all of these divisions that we've been talking about and become much closer to popular culture in doing so. There's lots of evidence there for that, but we can come back to that. This is another example of bridging, but I won't go into it. Now, the last part is I'm going to talk about is seeing power. This is our next chapter where we're talking about how scenes can feed into the political process. That's got a few sections, but I'm just going to try to give a flavor for what's going on there because we've heard a bit about this before, but haven't dug into it too deeply. One idea that we try to think about is what kinds of resources can scenes generate that can be used to affect or to mobilize political action.
Okay, let's.
Yeah, we're done with this chapter. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just briefly mention Joseph Yee, as Dan talked about how we're building on other students. Dan Silver was a student not even in sociology, never had a single statistics course, never had basic sociological stuff. He was in Committee on Social Thought. He grew up on Hegel and Kant, and he played in a band when he was a student at Berkeley, and then when he was here, he was a martial arts follower of Donald Levine, and I think he is a black belt, as did Joseph Yee. So Joseph Yee was a political theory specialist within the political science department. He was co-teacher with me of the Global Local Politics course for several years. And his PhD was called God. Yeah, I think we have, if you have that handy, let's just show his, the sections of his book, and it's a book elaborated from his PhD.
You mean I share his PhD?
Yeah, I sent it. Yeah, Alan, I sent it to you in the email about an hour ago with a link. It's one more. It's the.
You mean God and Karate?
Yeah, it's the. I think maybe it's the same file as Forrest Stewart. It's the end of the file name that says Forrest Stewart.
Okay. Yeah, it could be at the.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, just below there. So if it doesn't, I don't think there's a video, but just show Joseph's face briefly.
Yeah.
He grew up in Korea until about age 12 or 14. He then lived in Orange County and went to Berkeley and then was here at the USC. And this was from his PhD. And he was, he saw the critical role of young African-American men, and he wanted to study not just the bad things they were doing, featured by Forrest Stewart and by the media, murder, etc. His focus was, how can we find things that young African-American men themselves are choosing to do, which give them a sense of meaning, which give them a sense of involvement, and that they are doing, and that make them succeed in their own terms. That is, their sisters, young Black women, lower status women, go to Baptist churches with their mothers, and they have more of a positive role model, such that college graduate African-American women earn the same amount as white American women. Men, not at all. Men there's a big gender difference. So how can some of those African-American young men do things which will make them successful in their own minds, and maybe in terms of occupation and engagement with life, to overcome the deep alienation which overwhelms them from battling with their mothers? They don't know who their fathers are often, or their fathers are very distant. Okay, so let's just look. So here you see the table of contents. Just scroll up the table of contents. He found 4 activities, 4 kinds of things that these young men do. So Dan Silver talked about martial arts. The second one is evangelical Christianity, which Dan also talked about as generally not being tolerant, but nevertheless could be meaningful for some of these young Black men. The third is Soko Gakkai, which is a Japanese-funded Buddhist organization, international, and which has a branch on Chicago's South Side. That's 3. And the fourth is Amway, which is a personal sales organization based on selling things to your friends and neighbors, and there's sort of an embedded personal relationship. So all 4 of these have a roughly 40% have African American members, and they're very important in Chicago, New York, and LA. But they're not totally Black, they're not totally white, but they all have an important Asian leadership component. They come from Asia, not from Europe for the most part, but they are successful in giving a sense of toughness in the martial arts. At the same time, let's scroll down to the Fitzpatrick's Tang Soo Ko, which he starts with, and yeah, just look at these. These are the Confucian-style moral precepts, which are on the wall, which are not what you normally get in a Black gang, which you get these are not the rap lyrics that you're getting. You're getting instead something closer to the 10 Commandments, which God gave to Joseph, and which are followed as the core of Christianity. Similarly, these 10 articles are very close to the Confucian style. So the point is, you get a moral foundation joined with physical self-discipline, excellence, strength in the martial arts culture in ways that combine on the traditional Christian background of many African Americans, as well as a respect for authority. That's what's different from the New England egalitarianism. This is tough hierarchy, which is more part of the traditional American Southern white military honor tradition, but it is shared by many African Americans in New York and Chicago and LA today. Okay, so that the most controversial that commentators have on Joseph is how much is this anti-egalitarian. But I'll leave that simply to say that Joseph has consciously gone beyond just labeling the problems and say they're due to class or race or the media or Hollywood, and to say what are the solutions and how do they involve arts and meaningful activities that join culture into identity in new ways that are transformative, so that you can be a black belt whether your face is black or white or yellow or red. Okay, so that's the overview. Let's comment discussion from any of our students, of our TAs, and I can, okay, let me pause there. I'll bring in the discussion board questions if no one else has something to raise now. Nobody raising a hand? Speak out, folks, come on. We had a couple of you made some very good points. Here we go, Alessandra Peak.
Yeah, I just had a question about the structure of the course. Are you counting this as 4th week or 3rd week in terms of for the midterm?
I think the label on this is 3rd week, isn't it?
Okay, my economics professor was saying that this is 4th week, so I guess it's different per teacher.
I think we start with the first week of class, and we're counting the whole quarter as 9 weeks, not as 10.
Okay, so, perfect, thank you.
So what the faculty have to adapt their old syllabi, and maybe his and mine used to say week 4, but we had to change some of that because we've only got 9 weeks this spring. That's probably the source of the confusion.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, Brandon sent me a couple of the comments from the discussion board, and here one was, I wonder what these types of changes would look like in less urban areas with a different population. That's one reason. Okay, so that the same sort of question was posed about, and that was to Scenescape, the Scenescapes book, and what Dan talked about. Second is about the Theaster Gates. One intriguing question is whether or not such movements would be possible in suburban or rural scenes subject to ethical redevelopment. Okay, we're gonna answer that in various ways as you read on, or if you read closely, as you nicely saw. Thank you, Alan, for putting in the background of Dan's presentation those specific sections of the Scenescapes chapter which respond to these very questions. They show you that there are multiple ways we look at that. So first, the simplest way we do in chapter 3, which is on New York, Chicago, and LA. And in these 3 different cities, we show how there are many different interesting contrasts between the 3 cities, which we show in the salience of, and the numbers of, for instance, Catholic churches is off the top. There were over 800 Catholic churches in Chicago. There were something like 200 in Los Angeles. So Catholicism has had a traditional, critical, central cultural role in Chicago in ways that it did not in LA. New York is in between. Staten Island is like Chicago. Manhattan is totally different. Okay, so that's answering at the city or the county level in terms of Staten Island and Manhattan are counties from a census measurement standpoint. But I would say the label of rural or suburban, by contrast, are really very simple labels. They're still widely used, and from the background, in the old days, we only had data from the census or things, or people would follow those, and even in writing an ethnographic account, they would say, this is a rural area, this is a small town. But I'd suggest that increasingly today, including many countries of the world, and this is we'll explore this more, this is the big contribution of Levi-Strauss and of Mary Douglas and of Clifford Geertz. They all made the point that the isolated village is dead. The jungle village tribe, which had no contact, as Durkheim wrote about it with the Australian Aborigines, they now have television, cell phones, in the Australian tribes. And they go back and forth for education, for food, for etc. So the interpenetration is now one of globalization. The same is true of rural China, that you have people back and forth. So people are aware of these all around the world. So we need to have the subtlety which I pointed you to in Proust or Faulkner, or we as social scientists have to learn that those crude demographic categories are dead. Levi-Strauss pointed this out in Tristes Tropiques, and I think it was 1955. And the whole discipline of anthropology, as Bruno Latour suggested, we should study cliques, not look for isolated tribes. Cliques on screens. And when he said that to he was a visitor here in the Department of Anthropology, and many of the sociologists literally fell off their chairs with a sigh when he said that, but some of them are doing it. Okay, so the third way that we respond to the student posted question is how do these social background characteristics like suburban, rural, rich, poor, we answer those in a more subtle manner with the regression equations. And those were shown as big circles or little circles, which show you the magnitude of those factors when you control the other factors which also are going on. So in a rural area, you may have lower income, you may have less education, you've got some, but you can, instead of saying it's rural, we can say because some rural areas have many highly educated people and other rural areas have just homogeneous low education. We want to separate out population size instead of talking about rural urban. Population size is a continuous variable. We can put it into a regression. So we do that, and that's one of the variables along with income, along with education and so forth. And then say how important is bohemia or self-expression or glamour above and beyond income, education, crime, cost of living, and so forth. Okay, so that you can read about more, and I won't elaborate here. And we're not trying to teach you statistics. Just use what you've got. If you don't, instead of trying to say you need to learn statistics, we're saying you can read the whole Scenescapes book with zero statistics background. If you're a first-year college student, just look at the size of the circles. If they're big, that says the factor is important. If they're small, it says it's not. If it's zero or there's nothing, then there's no relationship. Okay, so those are quick answers to those questions of students, which are not, I'm glad you posed them on discussion board because these are classic questions which everybody asks when we're in this field. How do these things work? And as Dan said very briefly, and what we can talk more, and I introduced, I think, a session or so back. In chapter 1 of Scenescapes, we have both direct effects of the arts as well as intermediary or interacting effects where the causal paths that we illustrated with high-tech jobs can have a bigger impact on growing jobs if we combine them with self-expression. So self-expression is the scenes dimension, which is not just money. It's not just your job. It's can you meet with other people? Can you talk about your ideas in cafes and be able to talk about open source ideas and the share aspects of the actual software, not just talk about beauty and whether you can use shrapnel in a lady's headdress. Questions or comments from it? Yeah, okay, Brandon.
Yeah, just like one thing that I was thinking about, it's like I agree that we need to do all of this work around like not just like accepting these categories like rural, suburban, urban, but it's like even if we do accept those categories, like I was just thinking of a very famous paper by Lewis Worth called Urbanism as a Way of Life. which I just found a link for that I'll drop. But so there he's like trying to think about this idea of like what it means to be urban, and that is something that is related to this thing called a city, but is like a different thing. So it's like, especially in, you know, and that paper's from a long time ago, but it seems like that would be even more true. Yeah, 1938 when that paper was published. It seems like that would be even more true now, because we have the level of like connectedness that we have. Oh yeah, the level of connectedness that we have through social media and the internet is even higher. So it's like, it's totally conceivable to think about, you know, that things that are happening in New York and LA and Chicago are affecting life in like North Dakota or wherever. So I just wanted to flag that and to point out like a very famous paper that thinks about this that you may be interested in.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. I mean, I'm glad you linked. I mean, you've made a link through Louis Wirth back to Georg Simmel, The Metropolis and Mental Life, back to Durkheim, back to Max Weber, to Tönnies. They all talked about the rural-urban continuum, and that was seen as a core aspect of urbanity and urban innovation. My point, building on Levi-Strauss, is that from 1955 onward, if we want to take that date, we ought to think not just demographically, but culturally. And the cultural meaning of urbanity can now spread to rural China and rural villages around the world. And so that's the simple rebranding. And I have a paper now elaborating this, because both meanings, both sources of data, the census measure, are you living in a small town or a big city? You can then correlate with urbanity is measured with what's in people's head, or the kinds of art which they engage in, the kinds of books they read, the things they resonate to emotionally. And putting those two together in a meaningful manner is what the Chinese especially are really actively busy with now, such as what can we do to put in libraries or cultural centers or museums in rural China to slow this massive flow of people to the biggest cities, which is generating more health problems and crime potentially and other issues. And culture can and is playing an active role, even as you see in the Sister Potato Song. Okay, we're over our time. We ought to quit, but thank you all, and let's post more questions on discussion board and see if we can bring a few and maybe even pose them with so we can see your face in discussion here with people in the class time and have a little more visible discussion as well. But discussion board, all of these are working, and office hours, paper ideas. We're interested in your reactions and thinking. Thank you, Mo. Thank you, folks. All. We'll go on Wednesday. We'll continue a little bit with the TAs. Yeah, if any student wants to stay on now for a brief sort of office hour question, we can also do that.
Student schedule an office hour with me.
Okay. Spencer or someone else?
Oh, no, I mean, I just had a kind of open-ended question, so I just raised my hand now. I think he was talking about something else.
Sure, that's fine. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to ask it during discussion because I mean, it's kind of more. I mean, it's scene related, but it's kind of more towards my personal interest. But like, if we're taking, and this is like I said, an open-ended question, so I don't necessarily, expect a clear answer because it's kind of vague. But if we're taking scenescapes and their economic value, as a given for the sake of this conversation, I'm personally really interested in kind of what are their institutional blockages, so to speak, that kind of prevent more scenes from happening. Because at least I've seen, I lived in DC for a couple of years before this, and I feel like you can start to kind of see some ideological shifts by all of the development money going into the city that, you see institutional actors like the city government and developers, they have a vague idea. It seems that they know that past developments have failed in a certain way in not creating vibrant neighborhoods. So like they try to do things to create scenes, but it's in this very sort of like odd fumbling way. And it seems like they keep hitting sort of institutional barriers that, you know, maybe developers don't have architectural expertise to make inviting areas, or they don't know the artists, or, you know, city planning departments they have the plans, but they don't have the money to get them off the ground. And, you know, it's just kind of like throwing that out on the table. I was interested in, you know, like what are your kind of first, just like gut reactions, and where you feel like the forces that would make scenes kind of like hit these stumbling blocks.
Now that's an excellent framing of the issue, or a series of overlapping issues, and it's right on target in terms of what we try to deal with. And we deal with it in 2 or 3 ways. We can talk about examples of problems such as documented in the newspaper in Vancouver, or Forrest Stewart's ethnographic, you know, small area discussions of one neighborhood in Los Angeles and one neighborhood, and with the gangs that he studied in Chicago. So that's one way to get started, but to try to answer it in a more macro way, with regression analyses and the like, that may take a long time. Similarly, policymakers, mayors, developers try things out even if they don't know what's happening, but they'll give them a shot. And if they have a young artist or a young architect or a young urban planner who says, how about trying this? They may say, well, you know, for instance, I don't care about art. I don't care about green paneling. I don't care about, you know, ecological sensitivity, but I know there are lots of people who live in DC and who want those things. And even though my development background doesn't give me any expertise, I mean, I'll send one of these folks to a seminar and try to do things which may fit. Sometimes that works, sometimes it fails, as you're pointing out, especially as the people who are maybe even leading the seminar say, and as I'm saying now, often at the USC, we're frank enough and comfortable and confident enough to say, I don't know, and nobody knows. Or put differently, even if what we do know is the arts do matter. But where and how and why and how much when you control other things depends. And there's not a yes, no, black, white answer. It's a question also, of course, which art, what type of art, and rap music and drill rap is not the same as Wagner and Proustian novels, etc. But the point is, these are now all overlapping and mutually reinforcing, and in ways that with findings where what you hear on classical music stations and composers from George Gershwin onward would combine popular music with classical music. So you get these more eclectic blends in ways that would horrify sometimes an Adorno, but other times would enthuse George Gershwin or people like some of the top Russians and Germans who went to Hollywood and wrote music for film. So this was, or Faulkner. I mean, Faulkner, the top American novelist, Faulkner, what's his name, who wrote Ernest Hemingway and others. Basically, they worked in Hollywood for part of their careers. They hated it often. They were treated like dirt. They were paid nothing, but they nevertheless had exposure to it. And you have an interpenetration in that way of the more popular with the so-called higher art, traditionally in ways that are now more and more mixed in a literal sense, that they are consciously mixed using the technology of the, and I didn't want to advertise for Apple, but the iPhone and all this mixing stuff has now become available at a very low price to average people. Although so anyway, So I'm introducing technology, income, education, and lack of knowledge because the developers in Washington, the government officials making the laws or trying to use them and apply them thoughtfully, differ. Well, they're new often, and the recognition that people have changing tastes, and that this is not just the market or the production driving, here's housing and you've got to live in it because you work for me. That no longer works. And so people have to build housing and build scenes that will attract young, new, different sets of tastes. And that's where we are with the whole Chinese economy, as well as Washington, DC housing. And so it makes life, as well as, and so to build an econometric model of how does the economy work when it's clear from the economic data that consumer retail is much bigger than capital investment as a part of the GNP. So the consumer, in looking, as Dan put it, in the same aisle at Walmart's, you can get something which is closer to rap or closer to yoga, a yoga mat, or an evangelical candle can be sold on the same rack at Walmart's.
Well, I mean, we'll kind of going off that just kind of spitballing a sec. You mentioned tastes. I mean, I'm at Harris and the policy program, and I'm specifically interested in urban development. And, I mean, so even I wonder, kind of bounce around my head sometimes, how, if we're moving to this new form of economy, how big of a market driver could taste be? I mean, see, like you brought up Apple, Apple clearly appreciates taste. And, say, I'm really interested in different kind of ulterior organizations of firms and things in Chicago. And, if you say you had a made in Chicago workshop that, might have had a public design or a public, a sort of third place, like a cafe or a semi-private, semi-public space, kind of like what we're studying, that's kind of an amenity within a scene. Do you view taste as something that's malleable enough kind of in that context that, you can kind of, instead of, maybe Lori Lightfoot giving tax breaks to development in, the South Side, you could, start a workshop in the South Side that's, based in that neighborhood, and then kind of by manipulating public taste, drive customers towards your business and kind of, leaning into this model of scenes, whereas scenes can be, a driver for neighborhood growth if you kind of approach them as something that's malleable and that can be kind of, turned towards your own strategic needs as urban development requires.
I'm smiling as I'm sitting on a committee advising the aldermen in my neighborhood in Bronzeville, and the committee is called Culture, History, and Community, and it includes a man with an MD and PhD who was the former chairman of the board and the chief administrative officer of Michael Reese Hospital, which was the hospital that was torn down to make way for the Olympics. And it's now got about 100 acres of land, massive land area right on the lakefront, beautiful. And it's just been announced that a $6 billion potential development has been initiated, with one of the first tenants being an Israeli health organization. But where and how this links with the history and culture of Bronzeville, and how and why they chose this area, and how other tenants can link with this, is exactly what we have been writing about for the last 2 or 3 months. So one question which people ask are the same kinds of questions you see with Forrest Stewart, the Vancouver, the gangs, murders, etc. Can some of these angry young black men who are making drill rap films continue to use the art and maybe enhance it more, but more explicitly build on aspects of some kind of aesthetic, including Louis Armstrong, that is the highest quality music. And can one even start with an aesthetic sensitivity that could be heightened by making a better aesthetic statement? Okay, so I mean, that's a strong version that way. The other version, which you also asked, was, can we really change their tastes? And the answer is maybe. And if we look at the potato song, the answer is yes. The Chinese, I mean, at least in China, this is happening. This is a violation of much American general ideology, which comes from the Scottish philosophers, from Adam Smith, from John Locke, and many others. The idea that one egalitarian person should have their taste changed by someone else is seen as un-American. Yeah. Okay, and it completely conflicts with neoclassical economics, with much of psychology, and with the utilitarian tradition of philosophy in the U.S. background, and that matches the strong American individualism, such that unlike all the many of the European countries, the Asian countries, you can't leave your home unless you have you log in with the central government, and they give you a number which you can carry around on your phone and say, I'm now permitted to go to the grocery store. In America, what has Trump said? We're a federal system. You're governor of Texas. Why don't you make the decision? I mean, that goes down in turn to the individualism, which is so deeply different, in which at least prevents American social scientists and many policymakers from saying, we want to change your taste. So at least the framing of it, and I would say this also fits with the American educational system and with the late 19th century, is progressive education. That is the idea that instead of saying, we'll change your taste, which is built on a model that the educational system will tell you what should be in your head, instead the progressive educational system of strong American individualism says, okay, you're in first grade now, you're in kindergarten, what would you like to do? And then people play games, which the kids come up with. And this is not uniquely American. The whole Danish educational system has now gone further in implementing this than except what you find in a few places like the Laboratory School or the Parker School on the North Side, whereas this began historically. And there are aspects, there are aspects of Montessori in Italy. There were a few European examples, but the point is that many people around the world are now trying this out, including the Chinese. So in that sense, all of these are up for grabs, which just make the whole world and the economy and the political and social systems much more complicated and harder to generalize about in a black-white yes-no manner. We've got to learn to deal with shades of gray. And as I put it statistically, race, class, gender, national background, and age explain about 15%. 85% is not explained by those things. And so the developers who say, poor people live here, black people live there, they're saying, well, yeah, that's true. That explains 10% or so of the choice, but that doesn't explain 90% of what people will actually do.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that offers an opportunity, but
yeah, it's a challenge for you in the future that everything you're reading is not the future. You've got to come up with new, whether you're writing or whether you're buying or investing or formulating policy in a mayor's office. These are things that everybody wants answers to. But I guess that the one big message I'm giving you is don't look for one answer. Look for multiple answers in multiple contexts. And that's a way of reframing the simpler Newtonian kinds of models.
Yeah, that's a good point. And probably in a good one to end on, because I don't want to take up too much of your guys' time. I can see it's already getting late, so I appreciate you guys staying on and the